The only thing we can be sure of about the future is that it will be absolutely fantastic.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination Into the Impossible podcast inside of COVID quarantine. I think this is day 26 or something like that for the state of California where Michael is. You're up in Santa Barbara, Michael?
Yep.
So we've been under lockdown, but we're trying to do some fun things for the audience out there, keep everybody entertained while this lasts, hopefully not too much longer. I think this will be renamed, the year of the Zoom or something. We'll have to change the way we orchestrate these years. But, you've written so many books. Actually, I think, I can't see your hands, but I assume you're writing another book as we're speaking because this is what, your 16, how many books have you written?
Yeah, 16 books, if you count the essay collections and edited volumes and so on. I think it's 12 or 13 just solo regular trade books like this. Well, I've always wanted to be a writer. I like writing. I got to the point where if I don't do it, I feel anxious in the same way where, I'm a lifelong cyclist, competitive cyclist. If I don't ride every day or work out every day, pretty much 6-7 days a week, I start to feel anxious. And it feels like that for me. I always like to have writing projects, something such that when I'm consuming content myself, which I like to do, like most of us now, particularly in isolation, just grinding through articles and books and so on. And the reason I started my own podcast was because I was reading these books anyway. And, but it's nice to, when I'm reading something, to put it somewhere like, why do I care about this? Well, this is going to be part of chapter 7 in this project I'm working on about moral progress or whatever. For me, I feel better when I can fit it in somewhere. Like the reason I'm investing all this time in reading all these articles is this is going to be part of a chapter, and it makes me feel like I'm using my time more efficiently.
Yeah, I actually got that idea from you a long time ago listening to your podcast. You mentioned this is your philosophy, that, the one way to stay engaged with other people's ideas is to read their books. And you make the point that, books there's a law of physics that not too many people know about, but new books have to come out on Tuesdays. And you brought that to my attention. And of course, all of our books come out on Tuesdays for some reason. And every Tuesday you run the Science Salon podcast, and you usually 9 times out of 10 have a new author or a book or some work of note that has just been released. And so I took it upon myself to kind of follow your advice and reached out to a lot of people that have been guests on your podcast, and many of them have graciously agreed to be on. So in the future, we're going to have folks like Peter Diamandis and Neil Shubin and folks that you know and have had on your show. So it's a great treat to have you. I was on your show last year, Science Salon. That was a great treat for me. We talked for over an hour and a half, I think it was, and really exposed me to the way that you have a unique style of really as an intellectual. I think of you as a public intellectual. You're reputed to be a member of some certain 3-letter acronym that I'm not going to mention. But what I love about you is that you can do it all. You're kind of very peripatetic. You do everything from hard science, where you and I have corresponded a lot, down to the political, down to social matters and so forth, psychology, which I have no expertise in other than armchair psychotherapy that is now being conducted over Zoom, like most things. But one question just before we get into the meat of the book. We're going to talk a lot about Michael's fabulous new book, Giving the Devil His Due, and I want to get all the juicy details. I read more than half of the book in one sitting. It was just really gripping, and I'm a subscriber to Skeptic Magazine. For a long time. But before I do that, I just wanted to circle back to this podcast reading. I've heard it said that sometimes, though, reading addiction, it can be addictive. Sometimes it can be used as a way to forestall one's own creativity as a writer. In other words, I'll start writing my sequel to Losing the Nobel Prize once I'm done interviewing Michael and Peter and Neil and Mario
reading
Livio.
27 more articles online today. Yeah,
exactly right.
Oh, I do that all the time. It's a great procrastination. I got to just read one more article. I'm sure this is important important.
Yeah, exactly. And so the knowledge base from which to reference in the book just keeps growing unavoidably.
Well, in the current age we live in with the internet, it's so accessible. At any given time, I'll have like a dozen windows open.
I know.
Just like in the first hour of the morning, it's like, I got to read this. I got to read this. I'm going to come back to this. And, half the time I never get to all of them.
Yeah.
And at some point you do have to have some discipline. Like, okay, I got to stop reading and start working.
Yeah, exactly. There has to actually get something done.
And,
So how do
but
you
the
do
thing
it?
is, there's a lot of high quality content.
Mhm.
I mean, a lot of these articles I read, they're great, beautifully written, and well researched, and from a dozen different sources, and it's like, wow, this is a big improvement over in the amount of diversity of voices we have now, because the way before the internet, there was so many filters. Peer-reviewed journals have filters, and university presses have filters. Even trade houses have filters, if nothing else, economic filters. They can only publish a couple dozen books titles a year, so they have to be pretty selective. So most people don't get a voice.
Right.
Well, that's all changed. Everybody has a voice now. There's a lot of crap out there, but there's a lot of really good writers. I'm stunned.
Yeah.
As a lifelong writer myself, at how good the quality of so much writing is.
Yeah, and also the instruction. I want to get into the kind of art of pedagogy, because you are also an instructor. Let me go through your bio while we're starting here, because I don't want to miss any of the kind of basic facts on the ground before we get started. So I'm going to say what I have received from you and your PR firms and publisher, that Dr. Michael Shermer. Yes, that's right. You've got a crew. You've got a whole Zoom crew. Dr. Michael Shermer is a presidential fellow at Chapman University, the publisher of Skeptic Magazine, and for 18 years was a monthly columnist for Scientific American. He's the author of several New York Times bestselling books, including Heavens on Earth, The Moral Arc, The Believing Brain, and Why People Believe Weird Things, as well as 13 other books, plus the one that he's writing secretly while his hands are moving. His two TED Talks have been viewed over 9 million times. I got to think that's over 10 million by now. And they were voted in the top 100 of the more than 2,000 TED Talks that exist. Dr. Sherman received his BA in psychology from Pepperdine, his MA in experimental psychology from California State University, Fullerton, and his PhD in the history of science from Claremont Graduate University. He has a thriving website. You can connect to him there on michaelshermer.com. You can also find him prolifically posting on Twitter, tweeting away on Twitter at Michael Shermer, on Facebook at Michael Brandt Shermer. And the thing that they left out is sort of one of the things we're touching upon are some of the things you do outside of your work. You're a prolific cyclist. You were basically a professional cyclist in some sense. I mean, you competed in a race across America. And one of the first times I ever came across you was in a book called Mistakes Were Made, But Not By Us. And you're featured extensively in that book. And it's all about sort of the theory and psychology behind cognitive dissonances and how they are really insidious and how they permeate fields ranging from psychology to detective work by police to scientists in the physical sciences like myself. And in that book, you were talking about an event that really is the intersection. I think it's the kind of the ultimate Shermer moment. And I wanted you to maybe relate that really quickly to the audience, because you've shared it with me in person. But
the alien abduction experience?
Yes. So you're one of the few people I've met that has been abducted by aliens. I
saw the mothership. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
no, I use that story really to talk about abductees who say, I really believe that, this happened to me. And I say, I believe you believe it. In other words, I believe it's a real experience people are having. They are not, for the most part, just making up these crazy stories about UFOs and aliens to sell books. Maybe some do, but I think most of them, really believe this is the experience they've had. That book, by the way, Mistakes Were Made, But Not By Me, is by Carol Tavris. Great book. I use it in my Chapman University course, Skepticism 101. Really effective at sort of explaining how deceptive our beliefs or how misguided our beliefs can become based on these personal experiences that people had. In my case, it was part of this Race Across America, which is a 3,000-mile nonstop transcontinental bike race from LA to New York. Different start and finish points now, but in 1982 when he did this, we went LA to New York, and I finished third, and I broke the transcontinental record. And in '83, we decided to do it again. And we had corporate sponsors, and ABC Wide World of Sports was filming it. So it's like, okay, I'm just going to do this for a while. And because there weren't any teaching jobs, there was sort of a freeze on hiring after Prop 13 passed in California. So I wasn't going to be a full-time professor, so I thought I'll just be a full-time bike racer. And, I'm in my 20s, not married, no kids, no house. You're free to do that sort of thing. So I did. So I decided in 1983 I was going to see if I could ride all the way across the country without sleeping at all. And because I'd read some research on sleep deprivation, and that there was some kid who was like 21 who went 11 days without sleep at UCLA. And I thought, okay, for 10 days across the country, I can do that. Well, I couldn't. I made it from the Santa Monica Pier into Nebraska. And that was about 83 straight hours. And I just started hallucinating like crazy. Basically, it was early in the morning, and early, 4 a.m., something like this. So I'm kind of wobbling down the side of the road about 6 miles an hour in my bike, and every cyclist in this race has a support crew that follows behind them, like a minivan and then a motorhome and a support team. So you don't have to stop and go into hotels and restaurants and things like that. It's just all on the fly. That's how they can do it so quickly. Anyway, so but at that moment, I just apparently had this flashback to a childhood television show called The Invaders, starring Roy Thinnis, where these aliens were invading Earth, but they were taking over the bodies of humans and looked just like them. And so this kind of a body snatchers kind of theme. And but in the show, they could tell that they were aliens because they had a stiff little finger, which is really weird because, if aliens could traverse the vast distances of interstellar space and figure out genetic engineering and clone humans, but it's really their intelligence inside. So, but they couldn't figure out the tendons in the little finger. I mean, anyway, crazy. But that's what I thought on the side of the road, that my support team were these aliens that looked just like the people I know, but I knew that they were actually these body snatcher aliens, and then they're trying to get me into the UFO, which is just my motorhome. And apparently this conversation went on for some time where they're going, "Come on, Shermer, it's break time. You got to take a nap." And I'm like, "Oh no!" And I'm quizzing them. Like my girlfriend was on the crew. I was, quizzing her about personal details of our relationship, and the aliens knew all this. I was really impressed with this. Anyway, so then I took a 90-minute nap and snapped out of it. And there's actually footage. If you type in Michael Shermer, alien abduction, you'll see Eric Heiden, the Olympic skater who was a color commentator for Wide World of Sports, interviewing me and I'm crossing the Mississippi Bridge.
It was midnight, 6.5 hours after Lon Haldeman's crossing, when Michael Shermer reached the Mississippi. What Diana and I hadn't known when we spoke of a close race earlier was that Shermer was slowing down. As he told Eric Heiden there on the bridge, he was wasted.
Still feel pretty mentally alert? No. That's why I gotta get some sleep tonight. That's very, very strange things happened to me last night. I mean, like psychotic type experiences. Such as? Thinking my crew was aliens from another planet trying to capture me. Sounds ridiculous, but that's what I thought.
He was still in second place, but he was floundering.
But the point of that story really is that, first of all, personal experiences can be so powerful that they overwhelm rationality. That is, I meet a lot of people who claim, I'm on board with you about the psychics and ESP. I know that's all bullshit and all that. So I'm a skeptic too. I love science, but I had this incredible experience. Let me tell you about it. And they'll tell me about it. And they go, so I just think there might be something to this, because this one thing that happened to me. And like, okay, that's the power of experience. Like Eben Alexander, he wrote that book, Proof of Heaven.
Yes.
Proof. That's a strong word in science,
right.
proof.
Not evidence, right?
I mean, social scientists never use that word. Maybe you guys do in the physics, proof. Well, he went there, okay. So when you drill down into the story, he had a brain virus, and they put him in a induced coma because his brain was swelling. Anyway, they started to bring him out, and he had this fantastic hallucination that he thinks, he went to heaven. Right. Now he knows, he's a neurologist. He knows more about the brain than I do. He knows everything I know about near-death experiences and trauma and this and that, but it happened to him. And that's what made it different.
It's very powerful, those experiences that are personal. And actually, there's something to be said for personal experiences. In the end of this book, Giving the Devil His Due, now out by Michael Shermer, there's wonderful recollections of your, and rather unvarnished so, of your personal interactions, your personal experiences with people that have taken on a mythological stance in society, ranging from Richard Dawkins to the late great Christopher Hitchens, and I think it's and Jordan Peterson, of course, who you've interacted with as well. And I think I want to take this opportunity to kind of step back for a second and focus on the book itself, and we'll get to those interesting intellectuals as we proceed. But I first want to start with the title of the book and actually the cover of the book. So I, unlike what the common colloquial advice is, I always judge books by the cover. In fact, I almost exclusively will not be interested in a book if I don't like the cover. And on the cover, we have a quote from none other than Richard Dawkins. You may disagree with Michael Shermer, but you'd better have a good reason, and you'll have your work cut out finding it. Now, this book, I mean, it's interesting that he talks about disagreeing with you. This book is not really a polemic of sorts. It's really sort of a compendium of your greatest hits, sort of updated for, updated and brought to, modernity. Some of them take place quite a long time ago. And really, in a cohesive source, it's sort of an autobiography of you, in a sense. Although I hope you will someday write a proper autobiography, because I think that would be warranted.
I'm going to write an unauthorized autobiography.
Yeah, and you could be like Charles Barkley, who reportedly said once that he was taken out of context, and they said it was your autobiography. He said,
That's
I was
funny.
misquoted.
I haven't heard that one. I was misquoted. It was you who said it. Oh.
The unauthorized autobiography. I can't wait.
Yeah.
So Giving the Devil His Due. So
So the title really is it comes from this this play, A Man for All Seasons, this sort of collision between Thomas More and King Henry VIII over his divorce from Catherine of Aragon and his divorce from the Catholic Church and so forth. Anyway, in the play, is defending the law, and that we need laws that are fair and just for everybody, and his opponent is saying, well, we got to cut down the laws to get after the devil, the bad guys. And so he responds to this like, well, but then when the laws are all cut down and the power turns on you, where are you going to go? You have no protection. So we have to give the devil his due for our own safety's sake. And in my case, my devils are who is the devil? It's anyone who you disagree with, who disagrees with you, who thinks differently from you. Free speech is for people that we don't like. That's right. What the First Amendment is for. People that are saying things we don't want to hear. That's the whole reason for it. It's not to protect people we agree with. So the devil is really just anybody that's different from you, disagrees with you, and so on. And the reason we have to give them their due, give them their free speech, is because ultimately, if we pass censorship laws, then those laws could be used against us when we're in the minority, when we're outside of the window looking in, wanting to have a voice. And so I give some brief history of the First Amendment in the introductions, really starting with the Schenck case in 1919, when Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote his official position statement, in which he said, shouting fire in a crowded theater would be an example of a clear and present danger that Congress is, has a right to censor because this could lead to harm. Well, what was this clear and present danger at the equivalent of shouting fire in a crowded theater in 1919? Well, it was this guy Schenck, who was a socialist in Philadelphia, who was handing out flyers to young men who were of draft age as America was about to enter the Great War. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, to our ears, that's like, wait, you're protesting the draft and this is considered to be, so dangerous we have to censor it? Yeah. Right. Yeah. And so the moment, this is the problem, the moment you make that argument, and the argument could be made, this could lead to this, and before you know it, we don't have an army. So we can't defend ourselves. So in the national interest, we have to, protect people from hearing criticisms of the draft. Okay. The problem with that is that anybody's speech could be justified as needing to be censored, because you could make an argument for almost anything that this is somehow going to harm the nation or some particular group or me in particular or whatever. And So as I say, one man's hate speech is another man's free speech, and that on the eve of the Civil War, a lot of pro-slavery proponents argued that abolitionist speech, that is, Northerners coming down to southern states or sending their literature, or publishing magazine articles and so on, promoting the abolition of slavery, was considered hate speech. Now, they didn't use that phrase, hate speech,
Right.
but the argument that they made was this could lead to slave revolts, because if the slaves get word of these arguments, they may not like being slaves anymore. And then what's going to happen? They're going to start killing the white people. And then, so we have to protect our citizens from hearing this abolitionist speech. Wow. And same thing happened during the Civil Rights Movement with Martin Luther King. The reason he went to the South is because he targeted the most racist cities he could find so that it would get media attention, so that he could get it challenged in the law and ultimately the Supreme Court. And so people then made the argument, this guy is, he's not as bad as Malcolm X, but this kind of stuff he's saying could lead to riots, inner city riots, and that leads to violence. Therefore, he should be censored. Now, to our ears, today and in 2020, using the N-word or calling women this or Jews that or whatever, that's hateful, and we shouldn't do it. Well, I agree. Don't be a dick. You shouldn't say things like that, right? But the moment you pass a law that says, okay, we are not going to censor the kinds of things that, that challenge gender identity or whatever the popular thing is now. Right. In 20 years, 50 years, those laws are still on the books. And then they get applied to something else we can't even think of. So as a general principle, I'm pretty much a free speech fundamentalist. Yeah, you're sort of remarkable because you do. It was once said by our mutual friend Sir Roger Penrose about Stephen Hawking that it was no matter what you believed, you're in agreement with Stephen Hawking because he would often take opposite sides of the same position. And I see you as sort of this radical, extreme libertarian. That you don't cleave to either political party. And I actually pride myself in this podcast. I always say, as an astronomer, the reason that people love astronomy is that there's no Republican constellation or Democrat comet over there. And so it's apolitical by nature. You can talk about funding and maybe some climate stuff here and there. But in astronomy per se, it's mostly liberated from that. And that's what I like about it. So I don't want to talk too much about politics, except to say that this book, like many of your other books, the title is sort of a double entendre. And I look at the moral arc and I think about what you were just saying with regard to, the shifting legal zeitgeist of what constitutes speech and harm and danger, et cetera. And you make the point in the book, that Jordan Peterson, this famous case in Canada, well, his right to free speech isn't as guarded perhaps as it is in America. And he's very controversial, of course, but he did, free speech laws, when they're enacted, they come with the full backing of a government, which you point out could be physically punishable. You could actually get punished at the end of a gun for speech and perhaps even for thought. And I wonder, you've given so many talks at campuses, you're a professor, you teach on college campuses. Have you seen the decline rather, of the tolerance and freedom of speech at the places where freedom of speech used to be synonymous with UC Berkeley and other places? Can you comment on that? And that'll be the only political sort of campus politics. Well,
although I want to talk about tenure with you.
It's okay to talk about politics. In a way, that's where the free speech is most applicable because you guys will hash out your differences in some astronomical theory in the journals and conferences and books and debates and so on, and it kind of gets settled in the long run. Because I remember when I was started college in '72, the Big Bang Theory had just kind of won out over the steady state theory, and that's when I first noticed, so there is kind of a sense of progress. Like we have these different theories, but at some point it gets settled. Like that's the right one. In politics, it's so messy and complicated that there may not be a right answer, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, what's the right tax rate? Well, in abortion, very complicated. Guns, right. Very complicated. So if any place you need kind of open debate and disputation, everybody gets their position out on the table. So we kind of see where it all stands. And so the problem in Canada, like in France, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and a few other countries, Holocaust denial, for example, is illegal. In
Yes.
Canada, it's illegal under the sort of hate speech umbrella. That is speech that could incite people to commit violence against a particular group. In this
Yes.
case, the Jews. So amazingly, it's actually illegal. You could be arrested for giving a lecture saying, "I don't think 6 million people died." Now, the analogy I make to that is, let's say I'm a historian of Native American history in the United States, and we want to know how many people, Native Americans, died at the hands of Europeans since 1492. Okay, well, this is an actual field of study. How many people were here before, when in 1492? Well, we don't know, but 90 million, 70 million, 50 million, it's debatable. And then how many died by disease versus by guns and steel and guns, germs, and steel sense of Jared Diamond's book title, and that's disputed. But let's say it's 50 million.
Mm-hmm.
But now let's say I publish a journal article or a book in which I say, you know what, I don't think so. I think it was more like 10 million. Am I a Holocaust denier?
Right.
To be arrested for giving my argument? Okay. Now, that said, most of the Holocaust deniers I've met, they're pretty fringy, and they probably are mostly anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
But that aside, they have arguments, and if you can't counter their arguments, if your counter to their argument on some specific thing about Auschwitz is, well, you're a Nazi, that's not a counter. That's not a counter argument, and so if anything, under the principle, sunshine is the best disinfectant. I go the opposite direction. Let them have their say. Let's publish it. Here we did that in Skeptic. Here are the 15 things that Holocaust revisionists, as they like to be called, this is their arguments. These are their best arguments, and here's why they're wrong. We did the same thing with creationists, climate deniers, and so on. And ultimately, I like to think anyway, as in your science, it gets kind of settled. At some point, it's debatable this or that, but then we kind of get a refined argument. And anyone that's not going along with it, they're like the handful of people that still claim the Big Bang didn't happen. I know there's these Big Bang skeptics.
Flat. Right.
It's flat or whatever. It's like, okay, we don't have to worry about them because, they're so fringy. But the way we got there was through examining their claims. And so I apply that to everywhere. And as I wrote in the book, I actually wrote a letter in defense of David Irving to the judge in his trial in Austria, mainly because it was so outrageous. This is not even a speech crime. This was a thought crime. He got arrested at the airport. He flew from London to Vienna. And as they scanned his passport, it came up. He was flagged as one of these, sort of dangerous characters. And he was just going to give a speech about the Second World War. Now, I know his angle, the Second World, Hitler was a pretty good guy and he didn't know about some of the bad stuff. And so, okay, this is all bullshit. Yeah. But the fact that he gets arrested for just thinking a thought, because he hadn't given a speech. He was just thinking about giving a speech. So are we talking about an Orwellian thought crime? Yes, that's what we're talking about. So, Jordan's point there with that Bill C-16 in Canada, it sounds good from a kind of a liberal perspective of the moral arc and all that stuff. Yeah, we should call people by the names they want to be called. Okay, fine. And I tell a little story in the book about when I was in college at Pepperdine. One semester, my roommate was a guy named Dwayne. I'd known him from high school. And he hated his name.
Right.
So he changed his name to D'Artagnan. The fourth Musketeer. He eventually shortened it to Dar, and I still talk to him, and we call him Dar. And he said, I'd like you to call me this. We're like, what? Really? D'Artagnan? And he got his driver's license changed and the whole thing. And we're like, okay, we'll do it. But, just a friend one-on-one asking you, please call me this is one thing. Course, and, don't be a dick. Just do it. Be a nice person. Okay. But then going to the government to say, we want you to force that guy to call you that name, that's different. And I supported, Jordan's position on that to the extent that that's the case, that something like a gender pronoun not used by, say, a government agency or a university department or a corporation would end up with some kind of trial or some sort of conviction that I can't speak to. But in principle, he's right.
Yeah, and the right, as you say, the devil is someone that you have potential not to agree with on everything or maybe on any one thing, but that person is due the sort of courtesy that you'd like extended to yourself. So sort of a variant of the silver rule, if not the golden rule. Let me just take a break and ask you, what is the meaning? The cover is really cool. It has sort of this very three-dimensional shape to it. It actually looks three-dimensional in the back. Actually, the cover's behind you look even more three-dimensional. So what is the meaning? I can see the pawn, I can see the devil, but what's the symbolism going on there, Michael?
Well, we went through a couple of cover choices. You know how this works.
Yeah.
And
What's that?
Need to decline it. Sorry.
Yeah.
Actually, let me just turn off my phone where we're talking. So the symbolism is of course there's the thing that you see, you know, the person, and then there's, you know, maybe behind that they're secretly the devil, and you know it's not these people we have to give the you know the rights to. It's the shadow ones, the you know the ones that you know have the horns and so on. At least we think they have the horns.
Right.
You know, and if you look at the long history of free speech, you know, it's been a battle pretty much for the last several thousand years. And the reason is because governments and autocrats and theocrats, they don't want to give people the opportunity to dissent, because dissenters cause friction or fractions in power structures, which is the whole point of having a free press, is to allow dissent. And we now know from studies of the Nazi era that, you know, they never had a majority. Of course, when they were elected in 1933,
they were elected, right? Mm-hmm.
They were elected, but it was a minority position.
Right.
Okay, fine. That happens in a lot of elections, and like Angela Merkel always has to make these coalitions with different parties, because in Germany there's so many different parties. But the question I've always pursued is how do you get, how do you convert an entire group of people, educated, cultured, you know, the land of Beethoven and Goethe, you know, intelligent people, to become Nazis? And the answer appears to be, well, they didn't. Most of them didn't go along with the Nazi ideology. Now, there was rampant anti-Semitism, but there was anti-Semitism throughout most European countries. It wasn't necessarily worse in Germany than say, France or Poland, particularly Russia. You know, this Hitler's willing executioners, as Daniel Goldhagen called his book. There was a lot of them around.
Yeah.
But the general population, while they may not have liked Jews, they were not exterminationist in their ideologies and beliefs.
Right.
So I've gotten to the point where now I'm willing to say no Hitler, no Holocaust, and probably even no Hitler, no World War II.
Yeah.
That, you know, the people weren't that bad. And so, but how did they maintain power for so long? Two things. One, pluralistic ignorance, where the spiral of silence, where everybody thinks everybody else thinks something.
Yep.
In fact, they don't. Well, why don't they know that the others don't? Because the censorship of dissenters who would say, the emperor has no clothes. Did you notice that? He's naked. And if nobody can say that, then, you know, everybody, you know, falls into this spiral of silence. And that's why autocrats want to, you know, jail and censor, jail and prison, whatever, the Gulag Archipelago and the KL concentration system in Germany and so on. North Korea now, and so on. So, you know, us free speech fundamentalists, we want to push back the moment any government starts to go down that road, because they always do, almost like it's a law of nature, like one of your physical laws, that this is what governments do. So, you know, we didn't know about what our own government was doing, even Democrats like Kennedy and Johnson, until the Pentagon Papers.
Right.
You know, and now with WikiLeaks, you know, a lot of this crazy stuff, it started with Bush at the Homeland Security and all that, but Obama was just as bad as Bush. And so it's almost like, you know, you get in there and they go, okay, here's what's really going on. Oh, well, we got to silence these people. We got to do this. We got to do that.
Right. So on the eve of the release of Giving the Devil His Due, we're in early April of 2020. We're both in California, and we're under a form of self-isolation and so-called sheltering in place, not a quarantine per se, and not a true lockdown, but we're you know, demanded to some level, you know, not even to go to the beach and walk on nature trails and so forth. It's really unprecedented in my lifetime, and I'm sure in your lifetime too. We're not that much different in age. Yeah. But one of the things, you know, initially I reacted kind of cynically at it when it was the governor ordered that this, and I should speak carefully because he is my boss after all. But Governor Newsom, the wise and brilliant Governor Newsom, you know, didn't make this edict apply to the press, and I was like, that's, you know, he's just, you know, taking care of this fawning press that, you know, we all love, and I've got many friends that are in the newspaper business. But then I came to immediately realize that just as you say, this media is so critical to the reportage of truth and to checking on power. But I want to get your impression. Now we have this sort of micro media, which are these you know, bloggers and Twitter, you know, people on Twitter and Facebook, etc., that can really overwhelm and sort of storms of attrition, wars of attrition through their voice their opinions. And it could be something I agree with. It could be something I don't agree with. I mean, obviously there are certain really abhorrent viewpoints on Twitter and elsewhere. But there is also this potential now, not for governments to really police speech, but really this so-called cancel culture that you talk about a little bit in the book, and how anathema that is to the free, dissemination of information. So I wonder if you can talk about that, and why is it so prevalent on college campuses? Why do you get canceled from invitations or people like our mutual friend Ben Shapiro and other people that you've had on your show and corresponded with, like Jordan Peterson, that I don't know personally, but why is this more prevalent on campus than, say, by governments? In the past, it would be some government suppressing Ben Shapiro or, someone else.
Right. Or even decades ago, as conservatives that were more in favor of censorship. Absolutely. And liberals that were champions of free speech. And I mean, the ACLU has always been considered kind of a liberal, left-leaning organization. And, so there's different ideas, floating around about this. I have a chapter in the book called "What Went Wrong." I think there's several things. First, if we trace it back to the civil rights movement, that begins with being sensitive to speech, because words matter and words can be hurtful. And just pick the most obvious one, using the N-word. I won't do it. I don't even want to do it in print. I don't even want to say the word, and I'm an okay baby boomer. I'm 65, and so we've all been inculcated into this that language is harmful and we shouldn't do it. Mm-hmm. And so from there you go, well, what other words, should we not be using besides the N word? Well, you shouldn't call women the C word and call Jews kikes and on and on. Yeah, I agree with that. And that starts expanding. Now, in a good way, we all shift our language in the way we speak to each other informally. Television scripts, movie scripts, what the characters in movies and films and novels say, that's all changed. You can track when a novel was written or when a movie was done, just down to the decade, sometimes even the year, based on the kind of words that are used to talk about women, blacks, and Jews, for example. Mm-hmm. So all that is good. But then the moment you introduce like affirmative action laws and anti-discrimination laws and so on, then it's easy to suck into that the words that people use, and pretty soon you're policing language, and then we got to punish the transgressors. And so this happened over many decades. I saw it happening when I was a college student, and then in the 80s when I started becoming a professor and teaching, I saw the speech codes becoming broader, sort of concept creep. The category gets bigger, right? Things that that can't be said or shouldn't be said, and then the enforcement levers, not just like, say, government anti-speech codes; those are harder to get past, but the kind of norming of silencing leads people to self-censor. So while like at Chapman University, where I teach, if I ask students, how many of you self-censor on a lot of these sensitive subjects about, race and gender and so on, every hand goes up. They're all afraid to say what they really think. And this is more dangerous than a law that you can pinpoint, go, that law is unconstitutional. We need to overturn that law. Let's have a court case about it. That you can kind of is more tangible, but this sort of subtle bottom up, no one wants to say anything because they're afraid because the norms have changed. That's what's more dangerous. And, so, then there's a few other factors that, again, this totally reasonable liberal idea of diversity is good. I agree, diversity is good. And I'd like to see more black faces and more women and more Jews and more Hispanics and so on. This is all good. But then when you start to enforce it and you leave out viewpoint diversity, maybe we need some more conservatives in our department. What? Right. It's like, okay, so maybe you're not that in favor of all kinds of diversity and so on. So that was another factor leading to that. And I think, the media's kind of gone along with that. The academy's gone along with it. And now all those college students in the 60s and 70s, they're, tenured professors now. They're deans, they're presidents of universities. They're making policy. And you could see that from that historical trajectory. There was a kind of a logic to it. But, it still, I think, just went too far.
Yeah. Yeah, and it is sort of worrisome to me because I've come to feel that universities are these real citadels of truth and of course in the hard sciences there's a little bit of a different sort of standard, as you were talking earlier. Is there proof? No, we don't really talk about proof. We mainly talk about disproof, and maybe some of that carries over to the social sciences because you're entitled to your viewpoint, I'm entitled to my viewpoint. You can't prove either one, and maybe I could dispute yours. And of course the famous quote that I may disagree with you, but I'll fight to the death for your right to say it. Mm-hmm. So in this book you do take I always write imaginary blurbs, as if you'd ever asked me to write you a blurb. But
you're next. You're next for the next book.
I hope so. But I call you the conductor in the orchestra of cognitive dissonance that really makes the melody shine. So you really have this unique ability to really see with care. Once I was talking to a friend about you and your work before I went on your show, and he was saying, Michael just sees everything through these lenses, and I feel like you see that through the lens of exactly down, you look at polarization, which is not the kind that I study, and the light from the ancient universe, but your kind, where we talk about how ideas can be so disjoint, and yet we should have a sense of compassion, and I feel that you really exemplify that. And I should also point out that you made your lectures for your Chapman course. They're available on YouTube on your channel, and I urge people to look at that to see that compassion, as our mutual friend Heather McDonald says, teaching is an act of love. And I think you can't convince somebody of a point. You can't teach somebody a point. Not has to be platonic, obviously, but you can't convince something of something if you hate them. If you know that you have this displeasure for somebody, and what makes communication and teaching and learning possible is a sense of safety. So in the book, you talk about, and you kind of bring down your own version of how, I like to say, how you would govern the world, almost not govern planet Earth, though, govern a different world.
Mars,
yeah, that we experience from a distance, but it's looking more and more attractive. Although I do joke, recently on Twitter, I tweeted about how, do you remember back in 2013 there was this company that was selling rides to Mars, and it was going to be a one-way trip, and the voyage itself in complete isolation would be 2 years perhaps, just based on the limits of space travel. And there were over 10,000 people signed up. My friend Elizabeth Landau did a nice piece on this in CNN for CNN. And she said that 10,000 people paid like $40 or $50 to get on this list, and then the company went out of business or whatever. But I'm wondering, how many people nowadays do you think would sign up for that kind of isolation? And what is it about the mind that, you really don't know what you have until it's gone? And I worry about that for, having this discourse. But let's talk about the astronomical. Let's talk about governing Mars. So there's a famous exchange about 2 years ago between you and Elon Musk. About how one would govern Mars. I'll just say the title of the chapter is Chapter 14, Governing Mars, Lessons from the Red Planet from Experiments Governing the Blue Planet.
Yeah. So, he was, tweeting about this, as Elon is wont to do. And I find him such an inspirational figure of our time to even think about doing this. Like, we're going to do this. We're going to go to Mars. Oh, okay. I mean, that's how big things happen. It starts with an idea. Okay, fine. But in my world, okay, I don't work in the physical sciences, so I don't know how to get there by rockets or whatever,
right, and
what kind of structure we need and how to grow food there, potatoes or whatever. But in terms of a social structure, a moral system, I've always been curious as a sci-fi scenario. If you sent a bunch of atheists to Mars and came back centuries later, would they all have something like religion, and some belief in a god, something like that? Or if you just sent people that knew nothing about politics, would they end up with something like a democracy? Or they knew nothing about economics, would they end up with something like a regulated free market economy? Something like that. What I'm after there is deeper principles of human nature that emerge no matter what kind of social situation you have. So then I started thinking, well, what kind of government would we set up? Now, possible Elon will send his social engineers up there and they'll think of something no one has ever thought of before. And okay, that would be great. Then we could transport it back to Earth. Like, hey, you guys should try this here. It works on Mars. It works on Mars with 20 people. Yeah, well, try it with 20 million. And therein lies the problem is that, you can have a direct democracy with with a couple dozen people, maybe in like a university department where everybody votes on something, and you all know each other. But the problem is the complications multiply geometrically as the population numbers go up, and so the potential for conflict, and because of human diversity of different interests and needs, there is no one system. There is no utopia, and it's a dangerous idea to think we can design the perfect society. There is no perfect society.
Yes.
So you have to have an open-ended experimental system. So I'm inspired by science in this sense that Sagan makes this point in his demon-haunted world, but Jefferson did too. It's all experiments from what you can collect data.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say you have 50 different states with 50 different constitutions, and they have 50 different, say, gun control regulations. Well, those are experiments now. We can look at and try to control intervening variables and see what the effects of, say, gun control laws are or are not.
Mm-hmm.
And now this is complicated and hard, and different social scientists have different conclusions from the same data set, and some of it's ideologically driven, others are not. But the point is that these are experiments. So if you started off with a direct democracy on Mars with, say, a dozen astronauts there, what happens when it gets to, 100 dozen or, 1,000, 100,000
Mm-hmm.
or 1 million people, then I contend you're going to end up with something like a representative democracy, a constitutional republic,
Right.
like we have, because we've been running these experiments on Earth for thousands of years, and many experiments have been tried. Most fail. The theocracies, autocracies, dictatorships, various command economies. They just don't work. And it's not that our system is perfect. It's just, but it works better than some of these others.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so the idea there is let's look around to see what has worked here and take it with us to Mars, or at least to start. Now, it turns out when I was researching, there's other people like Charles Cockell, the chemist, biologist. No, he's a physicist, I think, in England, has written quite a bit about this. And that it could be, having multiple sources of oxygen and water and food, because we have to remember that it's the analog of Europeans coming to North America doesn't work, because
Right.
they had air, they had water, they had
Right.
food on the hoof and in
Right.
the streams, and our Martians aren't going to have anything to start with. So the idea that an autocrat could gain control of the air production or water production, that's really dangerous. So,
Right.
Cockell's solution is to have almost like multiple companies or multiple agencies, or instead of a centralized control and command system, you have many. So no monopolies. No one can have a monopoly. Anyway, I explore some of that in that chapter just because it's a super interesting idea. And then look at other earthly experiments, which I got from Nicholas Christakis' book Blueprint, where I didn't even know there was a data set of people that study shipwreck survivors and how they survived. Now, the
Right.
ones that shipwrecked and didn't survive, we don't know what happened because they're dead. But the ones so it's a fairly narrow data set. The ones that shipwrecked, survived, and were rescued to tell
Right.
somebody what happened.
So
Right?
there's some selection bias
Yeah,
there, right?
definitely. But it is a kind of experiment. These are called natural experiments. We can't control marriages and divorces, but we can see what happens with marriages and divorces after the fact, and look at what different laws about marriage and divorce affect, in childhood, whatever. These are natural experiments that you couldn't actually run, but they happen anyway. So in the case of the shipwrecks, it turns out more egalitarian or sort of horizontal control structures where everyone has an equal voice, works better than a hierarchical military type command structure, which is what most of these Navy ships were.
Yeah.
But when they got to the island and they're just trying to survive, then it turns out those kind of command structures didn't work. Those vertical ones didn't work as well. Anyway, it's just kind of maybe a small lesson for structuring things that are more horizontal, or giving people a voice somewhere, which is what democracies do better than autocracies.
Yeah. So that I've come into contact with that, not personally myself, but my research, as you know, in part is conducted at the South Pole, Antarctica, where there's isolation, complete isolation for about 9 months of the year. And the National Science Foundation has done psychological research studies on, among other things, what's the optimum ratio of men and women when you're down there. And that doesn't rely on, stuff from shipwrecks from, going to ancient Tahiti or something like that. That's modern day human beings. So yeah, I think there's some interesting parallels that could be
So
drawn from there.
what do they say about that?
I believe that the ideal ratio is about 2 men for every woman, or at least this is, again, don't hold me to this, but it was asymmetric, and I think there were more men than women. And I think the reason was it was 100% men. That would be bad, I think, was the decision because there'd be too much aggression and frustration.
Yeah.
But if it was all women, it would be fine. But they felt like they want to see what could there be some men and women together, and then if there's 50-50, then a man might feel, and you're much more qualified to look at the psychological aspects. But if there's 50-50, then you feel like, well, I should have a partner or a female friend down here, and I don't, and so it would lead to some stress or something. Again, nobody hold me to this on the internet. Don't send me emails or tweets. But the NSF has done social science experiments with the ideal kind of societies at the South Pole. It's also the kind of ideal place to go to if you want to escape from the mafia or your credit card company. And I can't always say which is worse. But you quote from here from two. I don't know if you knew this, but two very esteemed people are quoted within inches of one another: Kim Stanley Robinson and David Brin.
Yeah.
Both of them are my friends, and both of them are UCSD alum. And in fact, we have a rich tradition with the Benford brothers, David Brin, Kim Stanley Robinson, and others. But you also discuss with him, and I'll be speaking with him next week by the time my listeners hear this, probably 2 weeks from now. But I'll be speaking with David about his ideas for possible benefits that come out of the COVID situation, because it may not be all negative. There may be radical transformations, both for good and bad. But he does describe in the book, I think it's pretty interesting, the different types of constituencies and how you would do this balloting and how such things could work. And then also Kim Stanley Robinson, who has the Mars trilogy, very famous Red Mars, Green Mars, Blue Mars, fascinating science fiction trilogy. He talks about the different types of resources and commodities and companies and cultures that might pervade in the future. And I wondered, you're not a science fiction writer, but you kind of, you have some friends that are science fiction writers, as I do. What is the value? And Arthur C. Clarke, obviously, is a science fiction as well as a science writer himself. What is it about science fiction that allows us to sort of play what Einstein used to call Gedanken experiments, thought experiments of the future? Why is it so? Do you feel like, I don't want to bias your response, but do you feel it's been successful? Do you feel like the ways that we thought of things? I mean, Arthur C. Clarke is famous in 2001 for predicting many things, but the same could be said of The Simpsons. They predicted about have a very good track rate, including an episode about a virus pandemic spread by cats, which they call the perfect storm.
That's funny. I didn't see that
anyway,
one.
So what is the value of science fiction since our namesake?
Yeah, that's a great question. Really, I think that the more foundational answer would begin with, what's the value of storytelling at all? So there is a branch of evolutionary psychology that studies literature. Why is it certain themes come up over and over and over in pretty much all great novels and works of fiction, really related to human nature, power struggles, status, sex, all the gossip that goes around what people are doing and who's sleeping with who and who has power, who's honest, who's deceptive, who you can trust, who you can't. So there's good evolutionary reasons why gossip is structured around those particular themes, because they really have a lot of consequences for survival of both individuals and group cohesiveness. And stories then are kind of tapping into that, those sort of gossip themes that come up and over and over. Just think of any of Shakespeare's plays or Jane Austen novels. They're very much about human relationships and sex and power. And but one theory of the origins of storytelling is that it's a way of, like, a thought experiment in your head of counterfactual reasoning that helps you understand causal relationships in the real world by running them through your head initially to see what you think might happen before you actually do it. which could have
Mhm.
real world bad consequences to take you out of the gene pool. So running the experiments, because like if I do this, then she's going to do that, and if I say this, then he'll say that, and so on. That it's one theory about the origins of storytelling is that it's an evolved mechanism for social cohesiveness involving human relationships and interactions that are potentially high in conflict. So, just think of a Jane Austen novel where you get this kind of meta structure of, he thought that she was going to think that he might go to the dance with this woman but he knew that she was thinking that he might do, and that kind of meta reasoning is it's a story, but it's also a way of a thought experiment. Like, okay, what should I do down the line? Well, I better, like a chess player, back it up several moves to see which the consequences will be with the first move,
Right.
and so on. So I think what science fiction writers are doing is pretty much that, but they're doing it forward, into the future, based on what we know about science, which of course that's why I prefer science fiction to other forms of fiction, just because I love science. And in a way, it's a way of, telling a story about what could happen. And I find science fiction writers to be even more prescient than scientists on a lot of these things, because they have to work it out in a plot, in which you have character development and plot development and a narrative arc that has to go somewhere. So science fiction writers, I think, run those thought experiments more carefully than scientists do, because they have to keep a coherent narrative going that makes sense to them. And therefore, I think people like Arthur C. Clarke or David Brin and others, they're really well worth reading, both their fiction and their nonfiction, because even when they're writing, like when David writes his nonfiction essays and books, David Brin, I know he's really insightful in terms of creating these fictional stories. So he knows how to think through a thought experiment way down the line,
Right.
what the consequences might be. So he's worth listening to.
Do you feel, as David does and I do, that there'll be positive outcomes that will result from this awful pandemic that we're experiencing? Obviously, every life is infinitely precious, but will there be any bright spots or green shirts that could emerge?
Hang on there. We don't think that every life is precious. In other areas, in terms of just the speed limit. If you wanted to reduce the carnage of automobile deaths 35,000 a year, reduce the speed limit to 25 miles an hour.
Right.
Well, no way. We're not doing that. Okay. Well, and then I guess life is not infinitely precious.
Right. Or limit abortion,
Yeah.
in all cases. Right.
I mean, you could, so
Right.
we make these decisions all the time, and, insurance companies, they know the value of a life because they have to pay out, or automobile companies that have to pay off a settlement. What's the value of the life of the person that was killed by the car or whatever, judges, juries, insurance companies, they put a price, it's like $1.3 million per life or whatever. So that's already been done. We do that all the time. And of course, the thing we're in the middle of right now is, the economic shutdown, and everyone's Toby Young wrote an article about this and got hammered on Twitter yesterday for this, just bringing it up. Like, maybe shutting down the economy indefinitely is not a good idea, because people could die from other causes having to do with lack of food or housing, and without any income at all, you can't pay your bills. At what point you can't get food, can't get your medicine.
Suicide,
depression, domestic violence apparently is a little uptick on that in the last week or two. So it should be okay. Back to our free speech, it should be okay to bring that up and not get hammered as being insensitive to human life. Of course, we would all prefer nobody dies from the coronavirus, just like nobody dies from the flu, but people do die of the flu, and we're willing to, accept a certain level of that, but because we're used to it. So in terms of, silver lining, I don't know. I suspect that greetings will change. We'll all be doing the yoga bow or the Japanese bow instead, or maybe the elbow bump rather than the handshake. that I don't care. I can live with that. As for other things, I don't think anybody knows. It's too soon to tell.
Yeah, I always point out, that I believe that the origin of their handshake with your right hand originates from the fact that people, when they were armed, the dominant arm predominantly in society was the right hand. So you were showing that you weren't armed.
Right.
So what better outcome could there be?
Yeah.
I want to take a detour to talk about back to book writing and your process. We have a lot of writers. We host the Clarion Science Fiction Workshop every summer at UCSD. I believe this year will be probably virtual, but there might be hope that it could be in person. And that's a lot of listeners are interested in your craft as a writer, and you got into this a little bit that you write every day. But can you take us through like a normal day? I mean, you're very busy as a professor. You do family obligation. You have a young son at home, as well as a home life with your wife. But yeah, so what is your craft like? How do you actually maintain productivity?
I don't really have a set schedule all that much. I pretty much write in the afternoons. I usually work out in the mornings, or take my dog for a hike, then go for a bike ride, and take care of business elsewhere. And then, for a couple hours a day, I try to write. It depends on, of course, where I'm at. Right now, I'm just promoting this book.
Yeah,
I'm not writing another book. There's no secret typing
keyboard.
Here. No keyboard here. I'm writing the next book. Although I'm always thinking about what I should write next, and that depends on what might be the market interest in such a thing. And I don't just mean marketing as in money. I mean reader interest. What do people care about? And then what am I passionate about? What do I really want to spend the next couple of years reading about, thinking about, writing about, talking about? And but just to kind of take a bigger picture, I was always interested in the big question. So when I became a born-again Christian, and I was 17 in high school, then I went to Pepperdine to major in theology. I was really interested in being a college professor, because it seemed like a great gig, right?
Oh yeah.
You get paid to speak and write and talk and think big ideas.
Do you know what Neil Armstrong did, by the way, after he came back, eventually after he came back from landing on the moon?
Wasn't he a professor at
He became
Ohio
a college
State?
professor, in Cincinnati, I think, But yes, that's right. So that shows you we're in a very esteemed profession, right?
I like the life. It's great. And but then what was I going to say about that?
You're talking about when you graduate from Pepperdine after you're born again.
Oh, yeah. So I was always interested in the big questions, like, is there a God? What about free will and determinism? Moral questions. And it seemed like the theologians were really interested in these things. I'll be a professor of theology, right? And so, but at Pepperdine, I found out, that, well, what do you got to do to be a college professor? You have to have a PhD. Okay, what do I have to do to get a PhD in theology? Well, you got to master Hebrew, Greek, Aramaic, and Latin. And I could barely get through Spanish. I thought, oh boy, I got to switch to something I could do, which, I was pretty good at science, math, statistics. And so I went into social sciences. But I still like the big ideas. And so when I abandoned religion for various reasons, I was still interested in, okay, well, what is the origin of the universe? Why is there something rather than nothing? Is there a God or not? Why is the universe finely tuned? What is the basis of consciousness? Where does our moral sense come from? Are we strictly electric meat determined like a machine, like a cockroach, or is there some element of free will in there, volition or whatever? All of those questions, all the way up to abortion and foreign policy and immigration and so on. I always try to bring to it a scientific perspective from a secular perspective, because I don't believe anymore. But I'm still want to know, well, what's the answer? Maybe there isn't an answer, but what's my answer in my head based on what other people think that are smarter than me? There's a lot of them. So my writing is pretty much around that. Why people believe weird things was about the paranormal, the supernatural, and so on. So I debunked that. And then how we believe, the second book was, well, what about God? So religious beliefs and so on. And then, well, if there's no God, then what about morality? So the science of good and evil was the third book. And so my books kind of build on just topics I think are important, that everybody's interested in, and that I care about, that I want to know what the answer is, which is why I was really appreciative of you correcting me on some of the stuff in that chapter on why there's something rather than nothing. I just want to know. I don't have an agenda.
Yeah,
I just want to know what's the answer. And if there's no answer, okay, that's okay too.
Right.
Like the afterlife, my previous book, Heavens on Earth, I don't know.
Yeah. So
So I saw that bumper sticker once that said "militant agnostic." I don't know, and you don't either.
and that's right. And I'll fight you to the death for our media splitting the difference. I want to talk more about teaching as a professor. So let me first ask you a devilish question. Do you think tenure is necessary? Now, I'm sitting here, thank God, I am a professor of tenure long ago, but and I don't take that for granted in the bit. I think it's the greatest. I always say it's the greatest 3-hour-a-week job in the world, but no, it's actually a lot more than that, as you know.
But it's the autonomy that you have.
That's right. Yeah, it's the freedom to be an intellect, and I think that vignette that you were just mentioning, that we corresponded about, misconceptions that you might have had and I might have had. I think a scholar such as yourself is distinguished by the fact that he or she will be open to just learning and to being a good student. And to that end, I want to talk a little bit about teaching and learning. And but first, with that provocative question, do you feel that tenure is necessary in today's modern age? Do you think it's a valuable? It's the only field that has permanent. One of my colleagues said, "Be careful when you hire somebody on a search committee
Yeah.
because it's not like getting married. You can always get divorced, but with tenure, it's for life, whether you like it or not." Thank God.
Yeah.
I love all my colleagues. I'd never want to divorce a single one of them.
Yeah.
But do you think it's necessary in the physical science or in the social science? What's your feeling on tenure?
Well, I used to think it was not necessary anymore because the original reason to set it up was more because of the fear of right-wing forces suppressing the speech of liberal professors. And that was the case, say, in the 40s and 50s, maybe into the 60s. But then that kind of all loosened up, and I thought, well, there's really not much need for tenure anymore. I mean, professors are pretty free to speak and say whatever they want. What's the problem? Right. But now we have the opposite, where, professors are censored by, the political correct, social justice activists and so on. This whole identity politics thing is causing a lot of professors to have to go into the closet if they, I don't just mean conservatives, but I mean just centrists or people that are critical of the far left. They feel like they could be under attack, lose their jobs if they don't have tenure. So maybe we still need tenure. I don't know. But I mean, that's kind of a broad question. I think a simpler solution would be just, instead of it being a social norm that everybody practices, just let universities do whatever they want. Much like law firms, that you want to make you want to make partner. That's kind of the goal, which is a kind of a tenure for lawyers. But it's sort of institutional wide, and I think they've handled that pretty well, maybe. But doctors don't have the equivalent. Medical doctors don't have the equivalent of partnership, except ownership of their practice, something like that. It's slightly different than tenure. So I would say, leave it up to the universities to decide, what works for them. Of course, with public universities, and it's more of a government decision. But, when I mentioned I went to Pepperdine, it's a Church of Christ school, it's religious. They don't require their professors to swear by any faith, as far as I know. And I would love to teach there. It's in Malibu. It's a beautiful campus. It's much closer than Chapman to me from Santa Barbara, where I live now. But it would be their right to not hire me. Right. I wouldn't feel like I was being discriminated against, not being hired, because it's in their mission statement that, they're a Christian university. Why the hell would you hire an atheist like me? Well, maybe they want to, just as a devil's advocate. It's a good way to teach their students how the other side thinks.
Affirmative action.
It's a kind of, diversity of affirmative action, I suppose. But I wouldn't feel like I was being cheated out of a job opportunity and being discriminated against, because that's their mission statement. But that's a private university, so that's different.
If you applied to work at Yeshiva University in New York, you're not a rabbi. It would be very different. Although they have people that aren't Jewish that are professors there. So, So belief, but you're right. It's sort of be be harder to justify in some sense. But I still think it could make sense. I mean, there are people. I mean, we have a Nazarene school here, Point Loma Nazarene in San Diego. I've been there to speak. Beautiful campus. Also, these Christian schools are just so phenomenal. But yes, I think it's what interests me the most is sort of your teaching style. And one thing that struck me as a professor, and maybe this is obvious to my undergraduates, but I was never taught how to be a professor. It's sort of, oh, you're
Right.
smart and you did some abstract, abstruse research, so you must be really good at teaching. I mean, they're really different skills in the meta skill
Totally.
set stack.
Totally different.
And so I want to know how can you, well, I'm going to get to my big question, which I ask all the thinkers that come on my show later on, but can you teach someone to be a good teacher? So the question I'll ask later on is, can you teach someone to be creative? And is creativity inborn, or is it sort of, or is it possible to acquire? We'll answer that at the end of the show. But for now, what about teaching? What are the necessary ingredients to be a teacher? That's
Well, I think like most of us, we just have mentors that we admired that inspired us as teachers. Like I'd like to be like that guy. That guy really changed my life. That's how I felt. Like I want to be like him. Now, I think there's some temperament to it. I mean, some people are super shy, super introverted. Maybe they're going to have a harder time entertaining a classroom full of kids.
right.
But that doesn't mean they have to be bad teachers. They may be boring, but you can teach certain skills. Like, there's all sorts of tutorials about how to build a proper PowerPoint keynote presentation, certain do's and don'ts. That's pretty straightforward. But just sort of the emotionally engaged professor with students, that's hard to quantify,
Yeah.
right? I mean, some people have it, some people don't.
Yeah.
And I don't know how you bottle that, because that has to do with more with somebody's personality. And we all know there's a huge variation there. We've all had super inspirational professors and others that are incredibly boring. It is a little odd in the academy that, again, you go through all these training programs of how to be a researcher, like in your case, how to be a professional scientist and publish in scholarly journals. And you've had tons of instructions on that as well as modeling. And then you get hired and they go, okay, now go teach. No one's ever told you, well, how do I do that?
Well,
so you think back, well, I had this great professor, I'm going to do what he did. Something like that. Sort of all you can do is model.
Well, what I found so interesting is, and I think it's the only place in the entire, there's a federal register of approved documents. So it includes, like the handbook for working, I don't know, at the IRS, collecting taxes. It's a handbook for this. And there's a handbook because flight instruction, it requires a federal certification. So in the whole hierarchy of government, jobs and bean counters to tax collectors to whatever, centers for disease control workers, there is a single instance of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and it occurs in the flight instructor's handbook from the Federal Aviation Administration. I'm studying to become a flight instructor. I'm a commercial pilot. I fly a lot, as you know. And one thing I'd love to, kind of pick your brain on is we don't even get like the remedial sense of this. Now, in an airplane cockpit, I've known because I had to be a student, and to become a flight instructor, you have to be a student, you have to be a pilot, you have to be commercially rated, et cetera, et cetera. It still doesn't guarantee you could be a good teacher. You could be Chuck Yeager. He might not have been a great flight instructor, but nevertheless, there's sort of a basic level of the understanding of needs and purpose. And I'd like to connect that to chapter 10 in your book, Does the Universe Have a Purpose? And its subtitle is Alvey's Error and the Meaning of Life. So those of you who will remember the wonderful film Annie Hall, there's a character, Alvey Singer, who's Woody Allen's character. And he's another devil, right? I mean, Woody Allen has to be a devil nowadays. But anyway, he complains to his doctor. His mother comes to take him to a psychiatrist and says he complains to the doctor, the universe is expanding. Well, the universe is expanding, and if it's expanding someday, it'll break apart, and that'll be the end of everything. His exasperated mother upbraids the youth. What has the universe got to do with it? You're here in Brooklyn. Brooklyn's not expanding. And so you call this Alvey's error, and that's the error, sort of ascribing teleological meaning and purpose to life. And you and I have this interesting connection that we're both sort of irritated in a good way by the famous theologian William Lane Craig. In fact, the only reason I was on Ben Shapiro's show is that William Lane Craig was on his show, and I wanted to kind of point out some of the category errors and other claims that he had made that I found suspect and wanted to sort of correct, namely, this kind of first cause. It's always the same with theologians, which I have great respect for, that the universe must have had a beginner, and because it must have had a beginner, that to suggest a designer, creator came into existence, nothing that exists, well, the cosmological argument, and then it goes to but it always ends up with Jesus. And as a practicing Jew, I wanted to kind of take the angle and get into that from a Jewish perspective. So that was my take on things that I discussed with Ben on his show. And actually, you were one of Ben's first guests back in episode 6 of his show. And you discussed the multiverse, et cetera. And actually, Ben gave me a shout out during that episode that they would have guys should consult to me, and that was really cute to be associated. But I want to talk about this notion of purpose, and you talk about Alvey's error. So can you describe what you mean by Alvey's error? And
you mentioned that category error is, or you might call it a levels error, that the theologian is operating at some long time scale, like Craig argued, if in a billion years from now there's no Earth, and in 20 billion years the universe will be gone, whatever, what difference does it make how I treat somebody tomorrow?
Right.
Wrong level. Okay, it matters to the person being affected by you tomorrow. Mm-hmm. It matters to me how I'm treated. And I don't care if in a billion, I'm not living a billion years from now. I live in Brooklyn. The universe is, Brooklyn's not expanding, right? So, and that kind of error pervades a lot of just common thinking about what's the purpose of life. I think most people haven't given it that much thought. They just sort of inculcate what they were raised with, usually their religion, because, religion has sort of had a monopoly on this question. And scientists were supposed to stay out of that, non-overlapping magisteria, NOMA, Gould's famous NOMA, that's none of your business, scientists. This is what theologians
stay in your lane, right?
Stay in your lane, right? Well, I think this is crazy. Of course, scientists can have something to say about this. And even if you end up at some epistemological wall, say the difference between you and William Lane Craig on what you mean by the first moment, or what was there before the Big Bang, and at some point, the further back we go, we're just going to hit a wall. There's nothing more to say. We just don't know anymore,
right?
Or even some concepts like I struggle with in that chapter on why there's something rather than nothing, which you virtually corrected me on some things, but just the idea of nothing. If you keep drilling down to the nothing, not just no stuff in the universe, no stars and planets and people and so on, but no light, no space and time. There's not even darkness, because darkness would imply that there's light somewhere, but there's no light, so there's no darkness. And there's not even nothing to be nothing. I mean, it's just a word we use. And therefore, there's also no Platonic categories. There's no logic, there's no mathematics, there's no concepts of beauty or truth that exist separate from beauty and truthful things, and therefore there can't even be a God. I mean, the moment you say, well, there's this God that lives outside of nothing, no, that's not even possible by that particular category. You're making another category error. Well, there was no universe, and then there was. Well, where was God standing?
Right.
To create
and then on the other side, the devil is due. The Lawrence Krauses of the world will say, oh, the laws of physics. Well, where do they come from? And where did the quantum vacuum come from? And from whose perspective are we looking at the universe sort of externally to populate and create the multiverse, which is sort of a long chain in the anthropic line of argument. But I want to talk a little bit, which relies on that.
But let me just say, parenthetically, that after my conversations with you, I really kind of felt I understood in my mind that at some point we all just have to say, I don't know, nobody knows, and this may be, I don't know if you want to go this far, maybe one of these Mysterian mysteries where we'll never have an answer to it,
right?
Because there's always some regress. Where did the multiverse come from?
Right.
Whatever, and that at some point we just have a brain this size that uses abstract concepts in a certain way because of the structure of our world that we evolved in, and we may just not be able to conceive of something that's that far beyond our epistemology, and we just have to say, you know what, nobody knows.
I agree completely. Actually, next week is Passover, and I've preloaded a tweet, because I take off from work. I desist from work, so I'm not like the ancient Israelites enslaved and always enslaved to my iPhone or my work, my telescopes. So I preloaded 4 tweets that I'm going to send out in kind of.
You actually go off social media?
I do.
Wow, good for you.
Media. I don't email, and I actually command, as much as I can, my graduate students, because, if you work 6 days, I work with a billionaire, I'm fortunate to be working with a billionaire patron of my experiment, Jim Simons, who's rumored to be the world's smartest billionaire. And he also doesn't work 7 days a week. And I asked him about that once, and he sort of came down on the same side that I do, which is if no matter how much money you have, if you could be a slave to many different, we call it taivas in Hebrew, just addictions they're not harmful. I mean, they're not like, doing needle drugs or something like that. It's, I'm teaching and advising my students, but to be on all the time. And part of the meaning of the word Sabbath in Hebrew means a refreshing rest. It's almost like a pause that refreshes, the old soda jingle from the 70s, but it is actually an active rest. In other words, you're actually working to rejuvenate your soul. And I feel like everybody, Ben Shapiro joked recently, like we're all Orthodox now, with COVID lockdown, we can't do the thing, we can't drive, we can't go anywhere. Right. But getting a taste of it, there are actually green shoots. I say I'm spending more time with my wife and kids, and actually deep, advising of my graduate students that I just don't have time for during the normal times. And I just, I feel like that is that has been refreshing, and that to me is interesting. But maybe that's the answer to your question about the long-term consequences of the pandemic. Maybe we'll all sort of build into our weeks a day of isolation. Yeah. I mean, we didn't appreciate what we had. One of my friends, tweeted out this long list of things for herself, or on Facebook rather, so that a year from now it'll come up in her feed, a year ago, memories from this time. And it'll say, like, you couldn't go to the supermarket without standing on tape markers that were 6 feet apart. It's just inconceivable that we, right. But getting back to what you said, these infinite regresses, I find them very delicious. And my 4 questions, the famous 4 questions on Passover are, why is this night different from other nights? And the different children that ask these questions, it's meant to stimulate inquiry. And my 4 questions, and I'm curious, what are your 4 questions along this line? Mine are, how did the universe emerge? How did something come from nothing? I think that might be one of these chicken or egg questions. And I realize all of my questions are basically that. In other words, how did life originate from, how did we get from protons and neutrons to croutons, from inanimate things to things that life, and then from croutons, from Bach to from bacteria to Bach, and then and then really into consciousness. And is there an ultimate end? Are we alone? And all these are chicken or the egg. And I think that comfort, that level of intellectual facility, I'm not saying I exemplify it, but I think you do, and that's you're comfortable not saying I know the answer. Like, I don't know. It's okay to say I don't know. And I think in these times, everybody wants answers. When is this going to be over? When are we going to defeat this? And it's not like a military battle. You knew when you'd win or lose. Now it's like we have this indefinite sentence against an literal invisible foe, and we don't know when it will end or if it'll end, but we know life will be changed forever. I think this will be, kind of, I think Ed Young said, this will be Generation C instead of Generation X, Y, or Z, the COVID generation.
That's a good way.
I think it might change things even more. So we're coming to the end. I'm going to be leaving soon. I know you have some commitments, but I wanted to finish up with a couple of quick points. One thing I've always wanted, you mentioned this a lot, and just as a philosophy, it's rare I get the chance to pick your brain for so much time, and so I want to take advantage of it. Frequently in the book and elsewhere, you reference Carl Sagan and this quip, which I didn't know was not his originally, but that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So you taught me somebody else actually.
Yeah, Marcello Truzzi actually coined something like, but it wasn't as artfully put, slightly longer, and he wasn't as well known. So you get 2 effects. One, a sharper, shorter quip is more likely to migrate up, and there's that phenomena of quotes migrate up to the most famous person who ever said them, as Yogi Berra said. I didn't say half the things I said.
Yeah, and, that's right.
It's usually Yogi Berra or Mark Twain, and there's a handful of others.
Right, and George Bernard Shaw, and exactly.
But the way Carl put it, I thought was more succinct. And of course he said it, in Cosmos, that 500 million people saw. So of course that has an effect as well. But it was really first articulated by David Hume in his treatise on miracles, that a man should apportion his belief to the evidence, proportion belief to the evidence. So the principal proportionality. You should, adjust, as we would say in Bayesian reasoning, adjust your creeds based on the adjustment of the priors, and those are always changing, right? So,
Right.
An ordinary claim requires ordinary evidence. If I say, well, this is my example, I took the 101 freeway south to the 118 to the 23, and I went down and ended up at Chapman. But by the way, at the junction of the 23 and the 101, I was abducted by aliens, and we went to the Pleiades, and I met the Pleiadians who warned me to warn the Earthlings about global warming. Whatever. Okay, which part of that story needs extraordinary evidence? Okay, right, obviously. So, and that's a basic principle of all critical thinking and reasoning like a scientist is, what's the evidence? And
Right.
the more extraordinary the claim, the resurrection of Jesus from the grave, 100 billion people have lived and died before the 7.5 billion people alive today. Not one of them has come back from the dead, except for maybe one, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Is the evidence that's 100 billion to one miracle? Okay. Is the evidence 100 billion to one stronger for that than other claims about what happened in the Roman Empire about that time? No.
Right. And that's what I'm getting at, really. Just a short, little umbrage that I take at it. There's evidence, but it's not like, I'm going to go to my telescope and now I'm going to get some extraordinary evidence. I mean, usually
Right.
it's in quality or in quantity. In other words, there's either statistical, or systematic sort of uncertainty associated with data. And so if 100 million people said the same thing happened, would that make you believe in one specific person? Yeah, so you have to adjust your priors to do that. But I think, maybe my broader point is that we do have sort of this culture that now, with the decline of religion and the rise of the nuns, as your former guest Zuckerman, Phil Zuckerman, I think it
Phil,
is.
yeah.
That he talks about and documented at Pitzer College, that are we substituting science and even scientists as sort of idols? I make the case in my book, Losing the Nobel Prize, that the Nobel Prize to a scientist, you almost can't read a book. In fact, your book has, half a dozen mentions of just the words Nobel Prize, and that's fine. But we kind of use it as this imprimatur. And I always point, there's 400, guys in Sweden that decide this every year, and not taking anything away from the winners because they don't choose to win it. That's actually the only stipulation. You can't nominate yourself. So I always point out that reduced the challenge by one person out of 7 billion when I had to nominate people. But the point is, we kind of want people. We need, as you quote also in this book, it's really so uncanny how you came into my dreams and you extracted all these things out of my mind. But one of the things that I always talk about is the scene from A Few Good Men, where Jack Nicholson basically comes down, you can't handle the truth, which my father used to say. He should have said alliterative. It should have been alliterative. It should have said, you can't take the truth. But be that as it may, I think Reiner knew what he was doing, right?
Yeah.
But the point is, like, you need me on that wall. You want me on that wall because, who's going to do it? You. And I think people in society, the more educated, but not scientifically educated, this is more true. They want these kind of fifth degree black belt intellects, like the Nobel laureates, like the Carl Sagans, et cetera. And nowadays we're seeing it with like Dr. Fauci, like anything he said, like they'll cut off Trump during his speech, and then they'll immediately breaking news. We'll go to and Fauci's talking about like economics, or he doesn't know anything about that. And we have this halo effect. And I wonder, if that extends. I mean, Carl Sagan was a masterful scientific communicator, and he did great science as well. And it's sort of unique. Our friend Neil deGrasse Tyson, he often says, when somebody asks me to comment on some scientific discovery, I don't comment on it. I refer to a real scientist working in that field. He's of course an astrophysicist trained at the PhD. But I think the point is we tend to really want to lionize and regard scientists. And I wonder, do you feel like that is a consequence just from your observations of the decline of religion, that science and scientists in particular have taken on this sort of outsized role, which I naively will benefit from, right?
Yeah, interesting. Maybe. I think there's several things that could come of the rise of the nuns that really started in the 60s. One explanation we have for the New Age movement, the sort of New Age spiritual movement and crystals and astrology and all that psychic stuff, was the decline of mainstream religion. It was already starting then, not amongst the general population, but just the decline of power and influence of religion, which is why in the 80s, the moral majority rose up. It's like that was a pushback against what was already happening. They want to get back in the business of having power power and control that churches once had in the Middle Ages and early modern period, but we're losing. So, and I think one explanation for why people like creationists are so obsessed with, getting into science, because we live in the age of science. If you want to make an argument for a creator, you got to use the language of scientists. You got to talk about the fine-tunedness and the Big Bang and all that stuff, or else you're not in the conversation anymore. So I think scientists really have been elevated, just in general as a population. But like I remember when Stephen Hawking used to come to Caltech every year, and he would give a public talk, and this is in Beckman Auditorium, 1,100 seats, and it was standing room only, and they were lined up out all afternoon to get in there, and he gets a standing ovation for showing up. It's incredible. Right. And it is not, and now Sagan commanded audiences like that, but Hawking even more, because I think of the disease, it was a sense of like this brain, this just a pure brain. There's no body, just a pure brain of just pure thought. And so I get that. It's a kind of deification.
There's a Hubble Fellowship at the that NASA puts out, the most prestigious postdoctoral fellowship. There's an Einstein Fellowship, and there's a Sagan Fellowship.
There is. I didn't know that.
So that's for astrobiology and stellar astrophysics and all the good things that he worked in.
I wrote a paper on the Sagan effect, in which I actually looked at if there was such a thing as a Sagan effect. The Sagan effect is if you start popularizing science, your real science productivity will go down. Nope, not in the case of Sagan.
Not in his case,
nor with Gould. They were both, I think they both pushed over 500 peer-reviewed published journal articles, although to be fair, a lot of Sagan's were in, were NASA publications. That is to say NASA produced, so that was him and 500 other scientists or whatever. But still, he was, productively active in there, so you can do both.
I hope so.
But I think just to say that, because we're recording this, Cosmos is airing season 3 now. The second one of the reboot with Neil, and there's a Anne Druyan has definitely written kind of a spirituality into the whole cosmic story, which is all science, but underlying it in her rather poetic writing, most of what Neil says is Anne Druyan's words.
That's right.
There's in a way, I think science is our mythic story about who we are, where we came from, where we're going, what it all means, and everybody knows that, which is why, again, theologians, creationists, everybody, they kind of come to you to say, what are my best arguments for God's existence? I can't just use Anselm's arguments anymore. I need the Big Bang
updated.
I need inflationary cosmology. How can I build this into my theology?
And it's funny because I told you on the podcast we recorded for a Science Salon, on the day that Bicep 2, the experiment that I helped co-create, announced that we had discovered evidence, direct evidence for inflation, both the Discovery Institute and Lawrence Krauss, took completely diametrically. They both agreed we were going to win Nobel Prizes, but where they disagreed is, one said this is clear evidence for the fine tuning and the existence of God, and the other one said this is the evidence, Max Tegmark and others, that we don't need. Krauss always calls a supernatural, shenanigans or whatever. But getting to religion, and I want to conclude. First, let me conclude. Actually, I'm going to take this around. Maybe we'll edit it. Maybe we won't. It's kind of fun just to go all around with you and kind of just riff. And you talk about going on a version of a Hitchens Century Mile
Oh,
ride, but it was regarding drinking in the book.
yeah.
I won't spoil it for the readers, but you should get the book just for the description.
Hitch stories,
which are I miss him.
he was quite a character. And
I never met him. I had the chance to hear him, but I it's just take advantage of everybody. Take advantage of chances you have to hear the great minds. So let me go we just discussed God and religion. I want to talk about the origin of the name of this podcast is Into the Impossible. And that comes from what are known as Arthur C. Clarke's 3 laws. And so he says Clarke's first law is that when distinguished but elderly scientist states that something is possible, he is almost certainly right. Nowadays, we'd say he or she. When he or she states that something is impossible, he is very probably wrong. That's Clarke's number one law. Number two is where we get our name for the podcast. The only way of discovering the limits of the possible is to venture a little way past them into the impossible. And that's the name of our podcast. And then there is Clarke's third law, which connects to Schirmer's last law, and that is any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And I want to just give you the opportunity. Can you explain what is Schirmer's last law? Now, you didn't. You kind of named it after yourself, but it's
just
you
a joke.
You did so with great humility. I don't think you're vainglorious enough to, but it actually has some resonance to this. So can you explain what Schirmer's last?
Yeah, of course. I was aware of Clarke's three laws going all the way back to being in college because he was such an icon for so many of us getting started in the sciences. And but his third law I always liked because it's a great example of when I say there's no such thing as the supernatural or the paranormal. It's just what appears to be that, because we don't have an explanation for it yet, such that in a current example I use of this is that paraplegic guy that, or no, he's a quadriplegic, that has a chip in his motor cortex, and he can control the cursor on his computer, and he can do emails and play video games and whatnot just by thinking. Now, if you don't know about the chip in the brain, it looks like he has telekinesis. He's moving things with his thoughts, right? So, I can imagine a time sort of like a Michio Kaku, the future of the brain, where, we all have these chips and computers and we're wirelessly connected to the internet. You walk into your house and you just think Mozart, and Mozart comes on. Much like today we go, Alexa, play Mozart.
Yep.
Mozart comes on. It's
you just set off 1,000 Alexas around the world.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's really funny. So something like that. So then I got to thinking about that in the context of SETI and the possibility of extraterrestrial intelligence. Now, my connection there professionally is, debunking the ufologists and alien abductees and all that stuff, and debunking, explaining. But there's, as you know, real science, are they out there? And have they come here? Are two separate questions. Are they out there? Well, as everybody knows, scientists know, they're not going to be just like us. Like bipedal primates, speaking English with a weird accent with gnarly stuff on their forehead, like on Star Trek. These are the limitations of Hollywood wardrobes. But neither are they going to be culturally or scientifically anywhere close to us. So these stories you hear about, the alien craft landed in Roswell, and we back engineered silicon chips, which were like 5 years away otherwise. So the aliens were only 5 years ahead of us. This is impossible. Just because on an evolutionary time scale, the chances of an alien species evolving lockstep with us, in some other part of the galaxy perfectly within a few years is, zilch, right? They're going to either be way behind us, in which case we'll never encounter them because, they're not going to have radio technology or spaceships, and unless we go there, right. Or they're going to be ahead of us. How far ahead of us? 100,000 years, 1,000,000 years, a billion years. Look what we've accomplished, Moore's law, and so on, just in the last century. Extrapolate that out. They will be godlike to us.
Right.
This idea is not original to me. Science fiction writers have played with this for a long time, but I just codified it, linking it to Clarke's third law by calling it Schirmer's last law, because I'm never going to name a law for myself. It's just a tongue-in-cheek thing. But the point is that the future of, what we will be, and you could also apply this to far future humans. Yeah. Like what will the internet be like in a century from now? Well, hell, no one predicted the internet just like in 1950s or 60s, right? I mean, took pretty much everybody by surprise, how it evolved. Yeah. So we just don't know. And when we don't know, it just seems godlike. Yeah. And that's the point of that.
Interesting. So I want to conclude by talking about, one last thing about books. I've noted a commonality, just want to get your opinion on it. So there's a great deal of popularity on social psychology, on books such as yours, Steven Pinker's, Kahneman's, etc. And there's also a tremendous influence, and I think they're outsized in terms of their proportion of scientists that are actually doing the work between the number of books written by psychologists or social scientists and also astronomers. And I wonder if that's, and I wanted to get your take on this, maybe it's total nonsense, so don't be afraid to say so, but I think, psychology and astronomy are both the only two sciences, one soft, one hard, I suppose, that can be done with the tools and experimental equipment that one is born with, namely psychology and astronomy done with your eyeballs, which I always point out are two refracting telescopes. And really nothing more.
Right.
And I just wonder what, there's a surge in popularity of books such as yours and your friend Steven Pinker. I should read his blurb, which because it's quite voluminous in its praise. And Michael Shermer is our foremost explorer of alternative, crackpot, and dangerous ideas. And at the same time, one of our most powerful voices for science, sanity, and humane values. In this engrossing collection, Shermer shows why these missions are consistent. It's the searchlight of reason that best exposes errors and evil. And I think you guys have very common themes in some of your other books. But I think what distinguishes you is that you're kind of a little bit broader, that you really go into territory, the physical sciences, and explore things in a little bit more detail. Although I should point out, both of you guys are really outstanding teachers. And he has a free course, or a course that's his Harvard University course on rationality, which I've been watching along with my kids and my nieces and nephews. And that's called Rationality, and I urge people to go out and listen to it, because he's got some of the greatest minds, and he is one of our greatest minds. Yeah. And he's also one of these devils, right? That isn't afraid to take a side that's controversial, that could get him into trouble, but he goes where reason sort of impels him to go. And
he's fearless. Steve is fearless, and he's a great writer. Great writing still makes a difference, and I love seeing that. Books like Steve's and Richard Dawkins, for example. Steve Gould was a great writer. Yeah. And it's interesting. You mentioned about astronomy books or whatever. When I was in high school and college, it seemed like the most popular science books were astronomy books. Yeah. And I don't recall there being any psych books. Maybe B.F. Skinner, perhaps. He did his Beyond Freedom and Dignity, and Walden's Walden's Pond 2.
Oh, right.
Yeah, he had a second one. Anyway, but I think we're seeing the rise now more of this because people because it's becoming more recognizable that the methods of science can be applied to these social questions, political questions of race and economics and policy and consciousness. I mean, the study of consciousness, that really didn't even begin to the late 90s. Right. When Francis Crick said it's okay to study the mind, it's like, oh, Francis Crick. Well, he won the Nobel Prize, for his work in genetics. So he said it's just okay. So it must be okay. And then, Christoph Koch was a collaborator, and then Dan Dennett writes books on this. And pretty soon, the study of consciousness is no longer a woo-woo thing. It's now a scientific. So I think that's happening everywhere. I'm trying to push it into, moral questions. That science, if it can't determine human values, it can certainly inform them, and that has to be okay. And that as I chapter in Giving the Devil His Due, Mr. Hume, tear down this wall. This wall separating is and not, this so-called naturalistic fallacy, which I think is something of a fallacy. Though technically, my philosopher friends, and I'm not a philosopher, tell me I still haven't quite done it. But my point is that just saying, just punting the ball down the field and saying, well, we scientists, we have nothing to say about morals and values and purpose in life. That's for the theologians. Bullshit. Come on. It's okay for scientists to at least have an opinion and make a rational argument and put forth some empirical ideas, data about it.
We should be forbidden to do so, right? Yeah. Very good. So I put out on Twitter and Facebook an invitation to fans of the podcast to submit some questions. We don't have too much time, but I did get a couple that I wanted to highlight. So one was by an anonymous listener who wanted to know what is your perspective of kind of the future of skepticism, looking at videos. This person feels, that you tend to see a lot of white-haired, old white men, the dreaded old white men in the audience. And I'm wondering, where do you see the kind of ability of skepticism to sort of transcend demographic bounds?
Yeah, that person's probably referring to the so-called skeptical movement, which sort of officially began in the 70s with CSICOP, the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal. Yes. Never the best title. Now shortened to CFI, Center for Inquiry. James Randi, Paul Kurtz, Ray Hyman, Martin Gardner, all basically responding to the New Age movement, and people
Right.
like Uri Geller bending
Geller,
spoons and
mhm.
psychics and astrology and all that stuff. They were worried about what this was having an effect on education and policy and whatnot. And so that was definitely for decades, sort of an old white guys movement, as was so many of these kind of movements at the time. Now things are thankfully changing. You see a lot more women at these events and a lot more people of color, although it's still, pretty heavily slanted. But I prefer to not really think of it myself as part of the skeptics movement. I'd rather broaden it. It's sort of scientific humanism or Enlightenment humanism. And I don't use secular humanism anymore for this reason, because it really began in the 1930s and was very much a far left liberal political movement, for good causes, reproductive rights for women and civil rights for minorities and all this good stuff. But then by the 80s and 90s, it became like, well, if you don't tick these 12 boxes of our political beliefs, you're not a humanist. It's like, I only tick like half those boxes. I'm socially liberal, but I'm kind of fiscally conservative. And it depends. I'm sort of, an issues guy. Tell me the issue and I'll tell you. No. This is the whole set. If you don't believe all of them, you're out. And it's like, okay, that's not for me. And
All or
that's
nothing thinking.
kind of what happened to the skeptics movement and also the atheist movement after Richard's book, 2006, The God Delusion. It kind of was a split between the militant atheists and sort of moderate atheists or agnostics and skeptics or whatever. And it's like, if you're not militant like Hitt or Richard Dawkins, then you're not a true atheist. Like,
Right.
okay, guys, there's not that many of us. Okay. So, started kicking people out of the club is not the best strategy, right?
Right. Yeah.
And I think this happens with all social movements, that sort of purification of, who's not towing the line perfectly. I think it's very dangerous. I'd rather go for what I'm calling scientific humanism or Enlightenment humanism, just humanism in the broadest sense. Everybody should practice skepticism. That's the title of my course, Skepticism 101. But think like a scientist. Everybody should think like a scientist, because we all want to know what's reliable, valid knowledge that we should embrace and what's not, that we should withhold judgment or reject. That question applies to everything.
Yeah. I even tell my religious friends and Christians and Muslims and Jews that, if you are, maybe not a scientist, you should not fear science. You should not oppose science, because actually science could lead you to a deepening of your understanding. Just as steel sharpens steel, your arguments, your faith may be strengthened by looking into science. So certainly there's no need for, even the kind of detente of non-overlapping magisteria, but even in the case of actively learning about science, not relegating, that's, it's like George Bush Sr. was once asked, like, if you took all the deficit dollars and you stacked them up, how long would they travel or something like that? And he was like, oh, don't bother me I'm not a math guy. And no one would ever say like, oh, don't bother me. I'm not a words guy. I don't speak English. I don't understand English or syntax of proper grammar. But there's sort of this comfort or sometimes a badge of honor. I don't understand science. It's for those wonky eggheads.
Yeah.
And so I think, seeking out that diversity of viewpoint is so important. And it's one of the things you do extremely well. I want to ask a couple more questions. So one of the listeners asked me your opinions on the anti-vaccination crowd. Are they devils that should be, listened to, in the sense that, if you don't believe the vaccinations are, if you actually believe the vaccinations are deadly, or cause autism, for example, should you be excluded from the marketplace of ideas?
Well, no, not excluded in any legal sense. No censorship for anybody. But, and the voice of people that were skeptical of vaccines was actually heard in a century ago. There was a great debate in the 1890s and early 1900s about the value of vaccinations, and legitimate debates, in the 19th century about, how best to do this. Does it really work? Is it really worth the risk, and so on? But, as you know, in science, at some point we kind of reach a consensus, a consilience of inductions, a convergence of evidence from multiple lines of inquiry that go, you know what, this is really the best explanation, best theory, the best policy, or whatever. We should go with that. Okay, there's always going to be dissenters. What do you do with them? Well, you don't have to do anything. You just ignore them.
Right.
The problem is when they start influencing the body politic, and you get a lot of people that don't vaccinate, then you reach this herd. You breach the herd immunity and all that that people are fairly familiar with now. Still, of course, I mean, like this guy who did the autism's linked to vaccinations. His name is escaping me now, but it's all right. No, I don't think he should be, censored or jailed or anything like that. But, I think it requires a stronger voice that we stand up and say, we really need to follow the science. A Fauci kind of voice, someone that people really trust, which I think public intellectuals such as yourself and Neil deGrasse Tyson and others, it's important that they speak up and speak truth to power, as they used to say.
Right.
Because we live in the age of science, and the fringe voices are okay. That's good. Let's hear what they have to say, but let's put forth their best argument, and then respond, and then be done with it. Okay.
Do you feel like that would lead to, you've written extensively in the Moral Arc and elsewhere about, the civilizations that are last to adopt, women's rights, gay, lesbian, transgender right, that those are declining. There's very few of those that exist. And do you think that kind of freedom of speech supersedes all of them? In other words, that if you have that, then it would translate into more wider acceptance in different parts of the world that don't already have those freedoms that we now take for granted in the West, at least.
Yeah, free speech is, I think, the foundation of all other rights, the right to think and speak what you want, because that's the only way to find out if we're right or wrong about a particular something else having to do with civil rights and civil liberties. So, and we know this because the first thing that autocrats do is they shut down dissenters. They want to control the press, and so by their actions you can tell which is the most important of all the rights. It's the right to speak. That's the first one they want to squelch.
Yes. And the last question from a friend. This is Bernie Taylor, author of a book called Before Orion, a scholar, a naturalist about ancient cave paintings. And what he wants to know is there something deep in the so-called gods of old from really prehistoric times, 36,000 years ago, he says, that are projected forward in some sense psychologically? Is there something in the believing brain, as you would say, that compelled the worshipers, my ancient tradition, Judaism, and the Judeo-Christian traditions? Is there some embedding of this really Paleolithic, in our Paleolithic minds that carried forward to the modern or less ancient, to the Bronze Age?
Certainly something had to come along with it, because they're us. Yeah. Right? The people that made these cave paintings, they're Homo sapiens. Their brains are pretty much just like ours, with different cultures. So what gets carried forward is probably some foundational structure to cognition that then creates these stories and myths or whatever. I have a chapter in Giving the Devil His Due on Graham Hancock, the romance, the romance of the past. And your correspondent there, I think, is hinting at that. There's something about the wisdom of the ancient ones. And I think there's something to that, in as much as certain traditions like your own Jewish tradition, they experimented with many different things long ago. And so what we find, some of which may have value. Now you have to test each claim to see which has value, but some of them may. I'll give you an example. I just had Brian Greene on my podcast with his new book. That's right. And, he's an atheist or doesn't believe in God or whatever. But, when his father died, he said he really clung to the, sort of Jewish tradition of that. Shiva, yeah. Yeah. And that, this rabbi and, the traditions they went through and all that it made him feel like, well, this goes back thousands of years. So it feels deeper to me, like this is a more meaningful transition for my father and for the rest of us that are still alive, that we have that tradition. And I joke, you mean like the Seinfeld Festivus for the rest of us with the metal pole that was
George's father, right?
That was invented, last Tuesday. That's not going to do it. It doesn't have the sense of,
it doesn't have that cultural gravitas.
Yeah.
Right.
So I do recognize that, and so in the other chapter in the book about Jordan Peterson, I acknowledge the value of myths and stories that have their own kind of truth. Now, I don't go as far as he does about defining truth that way, but the idea that, novels and ancient religious writings could have, even if whether they're true or not is irrelevant. Even whether it's, the Noachian flood and the ark or Jesus resurrected, none of it it's possible none of it happened. That they're mythic stories that carry some moral homily or some message about, bearing your own cross, forgiving people, starting over, redemption. These are kind of moral truths in a way that I think have value.
Yeah, that stand the test of time, right? Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that about Brian. I mean, I listened to a lot, and I'm hoping to get him on the podcast.
You
so
should,
if you can reach out to him, that would be great.
I will do that because he's an interesting guy. Really.
So I want to close with an opportunity I call the plug zone. If there are things that you want to plug besides this book, so this is coming out April 6th, Tuesday, as all books do. That's Shermer's First Law. Which is the books always come out on Tuesdays. It's
actually, interestingly, this one comes out on Thursday, April 9th, for some weird reason.
Oh, maybe
because its original the publisher is Cambridge University Press.
Yeah,
and I went through their London office, so they're in England. So for some reason in England, the Tuesday rule doesn't apply. It's an American rule or something.
Okay, so it's not a universal rule. Okay, so
plug, it's other than the book. Just skeptic.com is the webpage of my magazine. MichaelShermer.com is my personal webpage, and Amazon bookstores are all closed, so great time to have a nonfiction book come out. But of course, Amazon is still delivering. I read this morning they just hired 80,000 people or something like that.
Yeah, that's great. And of course, the local bookstores. We had hoped to have you here, I should say, for an event, and we will have you here hopefully in the fall at UCSD. By then, you'll have written 3 more books, so that'll be nice.
Well, we'll all be wearing face masks and gloves
and fist bumping, or
Well, I mean, the virus isn't going to go away just because we all go back to work. It's
exactly right. Yeah, it'll still be there. Hopefully, we'll have a great breakthrough with my colleagues and our friends around the world working so hard on this. It's really an unprecedented time. So I want to also refer people to the fact that you are you have courses on the Great Courses, which you can also get through Audible now. They're a sponsor of the Science Salon podcast, which I tune into all the time. The book launch, as we said, and this should air before the book actually launches, and your Chapman lectures and everything. Is there anything else that you want to mention, or that I forgot to, or maybe I forgot?
No, I guess that's pretty much it.
Yeah,
it's all good.
Great. It's so much fun talking to you.
Great
I hope
to
you
see
enjoy
you again,
Santa Barbara weather. Go for a ride. And
I've been riding it. I've been riding in isolation. There's no more group rides up here. No more group rides anywhere.
What do you call that? Peloton. So it's
the
just
Peloton.
Really,
it's
no really
Peloton.
Widely spaced. Yeah.
No, those guys, they sweat and spit, and no, you don't want to be anywhere near a Peloton.
Well, we'll get you here for a talk in San Diego as soon as we can. And until then, everyone out there, thank you so much for joining.
You can be sure of about the future is that it will be absolutely fantastic.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.